In the late 19th and early 20th century, Australia was struck by diphtheria and typhoid epidemics that killed thousands of people. Diphtheria casualties among children were common enough to put the disease among the top 10 causes of death. And so it wasn't strange at all that in 1907, 4 children of the same Western Australian family were ill at the same time, but 3 of them dying months apart from each other did raise questions. Had the Morris children's stepmother, Martha Rendell, really been trying to nurse the young boys and girls back to health, or had she slowly been killing them one by one? Martha Rendell was born on August 10, 1871, in Hope Valley, South Australia. Most of the information about Martha's early life is lost to history, but we know that she grew up to be a woman who was described as having loose morals. That is, she didn't exactly conform to the societal expectations of women of the time. She left home at the age of 16, gave birth to 3 children out of wedlock, and began an affair with a married man in her 20s. The man in question, Mr. Thomas Nichols Morris, had 9 children with his wife Sarah, who was well aware of her husband's infidelity. It seems that some serious conversations at home eventually drove Thomas to move his family 1,400 miles to Perth in Western Australia in 1900. Partly because of work, partly to avoid a scandal in the small town where the rumours about his affair were spreading. But the fresh start wasn't enough to save the Morrises' marriage, which was doomed the moment Sarah learned her husband's mistress had abandoned her children to follow Thomas to Perth. Martha clearly wasn't going to give up. As the pair's relationship resumed, Sarah decided enough was enough. However, in a society where traditional gender roles and marriage were the foundation of the state and of the welfare of its citizens and their happiness and prosperity, divorce wasn't acceptable. So, even after their separation, Mr. and Mrs. Morris remained husband and wife, though only on paper. Curiously, Thomas was granted custody of the couple's 5 youngest children, a decision that would soon prove fateful. Almost immediately after Sarah left the family home, Martha moved in. Finally, almost a decade after her affair with Thomas Morris had first begun, she had achieved her goal. Even though she could not be legally married to Thomas, Martha was now considered Mrs. Morris and reluctantly called Mother by the children. To avoid embarrassing questions about the youngster's real mother, the pair moved into a cottage at 23 Robertson Street in East Perth, where the neighbours didn't know the scandalous truth. To them, the Morrises appeared a happy, respectable family, but behind the closed doors, all wasn't so rosy. Whatever dreams Martha may have had of her life with Thomas Morris, they soon soured. Because her lover was working long hours and the fact she didn't have any friends or family in the area, she spent her days alone taking care of the house and the 5 rather resentful children. Thomas wasn't a wealthy man, so no maid or nanny could be hired to help her with her daily tasks. Not that she would have wanted a stranger in the house anyway. Martha lived in constant fear that the truth about her immoral sham marriage would be revealed. This left her unwilling to make friends with the new neighbours, virtually confining her to the home. Then, as if life wasn't a big enough struggle as it was, an outbreak of diphtheria struck Perth. Diphtheria is a bacterial infection that usually affects a person's nose and throat and spreads through respiratory droplets or infected open sores and ulcers. The disease can cause weakness, sore throat, swollen glands, and fever, in addition to painful swallowing and difficulty breathing. Because the toxins produced by the bacteria kill healthy tissues in the respiratory system, a thick grey membrane made up of dead cells builds up in the area of infection. Today, diphtheria is fatal in about 5% to 10% of cases, but in the early 1900s, the situation was quite different, even if you had access to the best doctors and medical supplies. The second daughter of Queen Victoria, Princess Alice, and her young daughter Marie were known to have died of diphtheria in 1878. So when the four youngest Morris children, Olive, Annie, George, and Arthur, got sick with the disease in April of 1907, a doctor was quickly summoned. The family doctor, James Cuthbert, gave the children diphtheria antitoxin and prescribed tinctures to relieve the children's sore throats. During his many visits, Dr. Cuthbert witnessed Martha devoutly nursing her stepchildren back to health. She would swab medication on the back of the children's throats to ease their pain. The treatment, however, seemed to have little effect as the children continued to suffer from painful swallowing and difficulty talking. 9-year-old Annie was especially poorly. Despite the doctors and Martha's efforts to help the girl, Annie was bedridden with convulsions, vomiting and diarrhea before she succumbed to the illness on July the 28th, 1907. The death certificate issued by Dr. Cuthbert listed the cause of death of the 7-year-old as a combination of epilepsy and cardiac weakness. Fortunately, Annie's 3 siblings recovered from diphtheria, and despite the tragic loss, life started to return back to normal in the Morris household. But only a month later, Olive, George, and Arthur were sick again, this time with typhoid. Like diphtheria, typhoid was a killer of many in Western Australia at the time. Nearly 2,000 people were officially recorded as dying of the disease during the 1890s epidemic, with most deaths occurring on the goldfields. Already weakened by diphtheria, 5-year-old Olive died of typhoid on October 16, 1907, and the Morris family's sorrow didn't end there. In June 1908, 14-year-old Arthur began to suffer from vomiting, diarrhea, and an undiagnosed throat condition. Again, Martha would swab the very back of the child's mouth with an antiseptic tincture, which was a common home remedy of the day, but Arthur just kept getting worse. Medication prescribed by Dr. Cuthbert seemed to have no effect either, and on October the 6th, 1908, Arthur passed away. Understandably, after the death of the 3rd child in the same household, the Morris family doctor began to grow suspicious, suspecting something more nefarious was afoot. He asked permission to perform an autopsy to investigate Arthur's cause of death further. For one reason or another, Martha wanted to be present during the procedure, which ended up finding nothing strange or incriminating, and listed Arthur's cause of death as ulceration of the bowels, hemorrhage, and cardiac failure. It wasn't until months later that the disturbing truth of the tragic deaths of the 3 Morris children came to light. In April 1909, 15-year-old George Morris was reported missing by the family's neighbours, who had noticed the teenager's absence and gotten vague answers from Martha and Thomas about the boy's whereabouts. The detectives quickly located George at his mother's house. When asked why he had run away, the teenager made a shocking revelation. His brother and sister had not died of illnesses, but were murdered by their stepmother. According to him, Martha had painted his siblings' throats with hydrochloric acid, spirits of salt, to slowly kill them while mimicking the symptoms of diphtheria. George claimed he had fled the family home fearing for his life after Martha served him a cup of tea that made his throat sore. During his investigations, Detective Sergeant Harry Mann learned Martha and her common-law husband had indeed purchased large amounts of hydrochloric acid during the children's illnesses, but curiously, they had not bought any after Arthur had died. A family neighbour even claimed she had seen Martha swabbing the boy's throat, after which Arthur had screamed in pain and cried for help. Rendell's reaction to this? It's claimed that she had writhed in pleasure. When the bodies of the three Morris children were then exhumed on July 3, 1909, the medical examiners noted hemorrhaging and inflammation in their bowels. Tests done on rabbits and guinea pigs suggested swabbing with hydrochloric acid caused similar effects to these found in the autopsies, which secured the arrests of both Martha Rendell and Thomas Morris. During the trial that started in December 1909, the prosecution described Rendell as a wicked stepmother who abused and eventually murdered her stepchildren, whom she saw only as a burden. It stated that while her relationship with the children was initially somewhat cordial, over the years they began to lament her increasingly harsh punishments. Indeed, she is said to have beaten Annie so brutally that at one point the pain left her unable to walk. When they tried to stand up to her, this only served to rile Martha further, to the point that her punishments seemingly turned deadly. With the children gone, she would have finally been alone with the man she had pursued for a decade and followed across the country. The officer who arrested her, Harry Mann, told the court that he believed she delighted in seeing her victims writhe in agony and from it derived sexual satisfaction. However, the evidence against the Morris children's stepmother wasn't exactly bulletproof. It was claimed that doctors found traces of hydrochloric acid in the dead children's throats, which was highly unlikely because of the decomposition of the tissue and the inaccuracy of tests available at the time. Furthermore, there had not been any other documented cases where hydrochloric acid had been used as a murder weapon. Swabbing a person's throat with a diluted solution of the spirit of salts definitely wasn't the most effective way of killing someone. In the end, though he was the one to purchase the acid, Thomas Morris was acquitted, as it was believed he didn't know what Rendell was using it for. After this verdict, he proclaimed that Martha too was innocent, stating, quote, "I say fearlessly before God, I was innocent, and so is Martha Rendell. She may have appeared hard outwardly, but no woman ever had a more tender heart than she." Unquote. However, the jury found Martha guilty of the willful murder of her stepson Arthur Morris, believing she was a moral deformity and a human monster, as the judge had described her. Martha proclaimed her innocence throughout the trial and after being sentenced to death, insisting she had done nothing to harm the children. But no appeals were granted, and on October the 6th, 1909, exactly a year after Arthur's death, Martha Rendell was executed by hanging at Fremantle Prison. She was the first woman in Western Australia to be hanged in 38 years, and the last, making Martha Rendell one of only 2 women executed in Australia during the 20th century. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story that will make you say, "Well, I never."